education and research and how to do it, and then how to share it with other people. Worked for the GCRC as a research subject advocate for a few years, and then I ended up in the collaborative antiviral study group over in pediatrics. We didn't do just pediatric studies, we did adult studies, and had about 90, we oversaw about 90 sites around the country, 70 to 90 sites at different times around the US, Canada, Sweden, and the UK. And I had to go to Sweden once a year for a while, so I was very sad. It was very tough. But that money kind of went away. Though it was we were funded by the NIH, and it lasted for about 30 years. I wasn't there the whole time, but anyhow, funding mechanisms changed. And now I pretty much do education, and I work with the Clinical Research Support Program. We also oversee IND/IDE development. I have a team that works on preparing those, with assisting investigators in preparing that, as well as clinicaltrials.gov. So if you do any research, you'll see my name fly by periodically, because we try to make sure that everybody's compliant at UAB with that. So that's enough. Now we have to find Cindy here.
Wow, that is up close and personal.
It's a little different than the last time. So I can't. Oh, I've got Darty's name, so I'm going to assume it's in there. No? All right. That's not it. Those are older slides. We can. Oh, you know what? Let's do this. Jump drive. Remove the disk. We're getting closer. There we go. All right, Cindy. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Right, so if Dr. Tolley comes in, I'll stop and he can do his little introduction. But I'm Cindy Joyner. I'm in the Division of Cardiovascular Disease. I'm the director for the Clinical Trials Unit. And so I've been at UAB for about 15 years. Various aspects of research. I've been at the bench. I've done regulatory. I've done financial, contracts, budgets, lab processing, coordination. I moved into management. And then when I finished my PhD in nursing, I moved into kind of an investigator role to see if that's something I wanted to do myself. And then I also helped create a clinical trial unit in GI, hepatology, and cardiology. So I've got a wide variety of experience, and it's predominantly been in clinical trials. Like Penny, I'm a nurse by training, and so my nursing experience was in critical care at Children's, and so I've seen a lot of different aspects of research and care. So what I'm going to talk to you about is roles and responsibilities. Today, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the investigator's role and how critical that is, which I think most everybody that is involved in research understands. So we talk about the principal investigator, we talk about the PI, another one of those acronyms, and we like to say that the PI is extremely involved. We always joke that it doesn't mean practically invisible. They need to be there, they need to participate. And so these are just the objectives we're going to try to accomplish today, to talk about roles and responsibility of each team, identify human participant protections. We're going to talk about the FDA 1572, which is a form that's specific to drug studies. However, we're using it as an example. When we get to that part, there's commitments on the back of that form, and that's what we're really going to focus on, that applies to all types of research that involve humans. And then we're going to touch on scientific misconduct. So if you're part of a team and you're lucky to be part of a team in research, you might have all these different members that help you conduct the clinical trial. You can have an investigator, you can have a sub-investigator, a coordinator, it can be a nurse or a non-nurse. You might have a financial administrator, regulatory person, data manager, lab technician, pharmacist. And then there are those shops, then I've been in them before, where you have the investigator and you have the coordinator. And the two of them are everything. So if you're a smaller area, you might do all of these yourself. If you're lucky to be part of a larger center, you might have different people that break out and handle these responsibilities. This just highlights, it's important that we focus on team. We'll talk about team a lot through today, but you can't do it alone. You need to have good communication, you have to have good team players and partners in order to accomplish the goals of the study and to make sure that the patients are taken care of and you have good data. So the role of the PI is critical. The PI is the one that oversees every aspect of the study. They are truly responsible for everything that occurs in the study. They can delegate roles and responsibilities to staff. They must adhere to the 1572 and those commitments, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. If anything goes wrong with the study, if there's any type of scientific misconduct, that falls on the responsibility of the investigator. They must be present and involved, and they need to communicate with staff and study participants. And this can be challenging, especially if you have an investigator who might have clinical responsibilities, patients in clinic or the hospital, and they're doing research at the same time. Their schedules can be very hectic, and so communicating and finding a way to communicate is really important to the success of the study. This outlines, again, kind of what we just talked about, what the PI is responsible for. But again, being charged with the conduct of objective research. So where Penny touched on therapeutic misconduct, it's important that that investigator make sure that they understand when they're in their research role and when they're in their clinical care role. They're responsible for the management and integrity of the study. That includes every aspect of the study, the design, conduct, reporting, all of those aspects. And then direction and oversight of compliance, so understanding those federal regulations and the GCPs. The PI has a large scope of responsibilities, and we'll talk about the scope of coordinator responsibilities in just a minute, but they are very similar. So they have scientific and administrative responsibilities. It's not just the conduct of the study and the scientific proposals, but it's also understanding the space and equipment management, reporting, project closeouts, the finances and the budgets, which are critical. And sometimes those are the areas that investigators tend to delegate off and just have confidence that somebody's going to handle those. But as an investigator, they need to understand what the money is, what's coming in, what's going out, and where it's being sourced to. So it's just kind of highlighting what oversight is. We talk a lot about oversight, but what does it mean? And so there are all these rules, standards, compliance, guidelines, reviews, all of these codes and audits, things like this that play into oversight and fall under the investigator to make sure are done properly in the study. We talked about it being very common for investigators to delegate tasks. If you had a study or you're familiar with the study and the delegation log, this is where an investigator delegates tasks and responsibilities to study staff. Typically in an industry study, they'll provide you with that particular log. If you're doing an investigator-initiated study or an NIH study, if they don't provide you with a log like that, it's something that you should create. And in Karen's talk during study a little bit later this morning, she's going to talk about some tools that are used. But a lot of times we focus on industry and what they provide us with, but we should treat all research the same. And so there are a lot of tools that you should use in investigator-initiated trials as well. When an investigator delegates the responsibility to a study team member, it should be documented. So that way everybody knows who's responsible for what. And a team member doesn't realize they have been delegated a task or responsibility that they're not aware of. The 1572, this is a standard form that the FDA has created and made available. It's strictly for investigational drug studies. If you do device studies, there's no standard form. There's something called an investigator agreement. It's usually specific to industry or companies, so any company can create their own. And if you do behavioral studies, there's also an investigator agreement or investigator documentation. And it just highlights those commitments we're going to talk about, making sure that investigators are aware of what they're responsible for during the conduct of the study. So what we're going to focus on is the 1572, just because it's easy, it's standard, it's straightforward, and it outlines what we want to talk about. So we complete the 1572 or an investigator agreement. It's this contract between the investigator and the sponsor, letting them know that they are going to complete their obligations as an investigator, and follow all the guidelines surrounding the clinical trial. You have a handout of the 1572. It's probably a lot easier to see than this, but the 1572, it can be anywhere from 1 to 4 pages depending on the amount of information you put in it. You know, on here, the front page, numbers 1 through 7, it's standard information. They want to know the PI's name, address, making sure you have a CV for the investigator on file that shows all their experience and qualifications, any research facility that you're going to be conducting your study in. That means not just your office. You need to think about anywhere that you or your patients will touch when you're conducting a study. If they're going to be over at Highlands, but they might be at Kirkland, you're using the research pharmacy in North Pavilion, but then maybe you're using CVMRI in Bochelle. Any place that you or your patients are touching needs to be listed under research facilities or laboratories. Basically, they want to know where you're doing your work so that we have some form of documentation. Your IRB, we'll talk a little bit more about this a little later this morning, but at UAB, we have 2 IRBs. We have the local UAB IRB, and for industry studies or sponsored studies, we have Western IRB, which is a central IRB. So depending on the type of study you have, the sponsor of the study, you could use one of those IRBs, and there are some caveats with it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. You want to list all of your sub-investigators. That means if the investigator has maybe 3 colleagues that are working on the study, or there's collaborators that are going to be seeing the patients or involved in the data analysis, somehow highly involved in the study, they should be listed as a sub-investigator. Some sponsors might require that the coordinators be listed. It's not a requirement. It's something that you can decide, for your site. I know in our area we don't do that. We like it to be mainly the physicians, nurse practitioners. And then there's a protocol number that you would list on the form. On the back of that form is a summary. They talk about summary and then these commitments that the PI is agreeing to fulfill when they sign this form. And then the PI signs and dates it. There's also a section on the very bottom that warns of willfully falsifying data and the criminal offense for falsification or fraud. As an investigator or anybody involved in clinical trials, especially drug trials, you should know what this form is. I've had investigators who I have thought have been seasoned investigators, and they just sign and sign and sign because there's so much paperwork in clinical research. And that they've signed these for years, but then when somebody says, well, I'm not going to, a monitor comes, they're looking at your site as to whether or not they're going to use your site for a study. They sit down with the investigator and they say, I know you're very familiar with the 1572. You've been doing research for years. We're not going to go over it. And the investigator says, well, what's a 1572? I've had that happen more than once. And so as a research team member or an investigator, you need to be familiar with the form. When that's happened and I've been in the room, we have not gotten that study. It doesn't matter how seasoned the investigator has been. The sponsors walked away. So make sure that you understand what the important forms and documents are.
What about if it's investigational device with a combination drug product? Is there a 1572?
Device and drug?
Yeah.
There might be a 1572 for the drug, and then there's going to be an investigator agreement for the device. So the device world is still kind of figuring out what they're going to do. We do a lot of device research in cardiology. At UAB, if you have a device study, UAB has developed a template investigator agreement that can be used, because otherwise that investigator agreement for device studies, even though it's seen by sponsors as a regulatory document, is seen by the institution as a contract, because it's not a standard form like the 1572. But if you have a dual study like that, you're probably going to have 2 forms. So on the 1572, there's these 9 commitments. if you have an investigator agreement for device or behavioral, you're going to have some of these very similar commitments that might just be worded a little bit differently. But first and foremost, the investigator agrees to follow the protocol. It sounds simple, but that includes eligibility, study visits and assessments, timelines, dosing, concomitant medication restrictions, endpoint collection. The way the protocol is written, they're going to follow it, they're not going to tailor it, they're not going to edit it, and they're not going to make any adjustments to it without permission from the sponsor or the IRB. And when I started doing research, a lot of times sponsors would offer waivers. They'd be like, well, yes, that patient doesn't fit the eligibility criteria, but we'll allow you to enter them anyway. That doesn't really happen anymore. They've become much more strict. The criteria are there. The only way the criteria are going to change is if the sponsor changes the protocol. So, they're agreeing to follow the protocol. Commitment 2, personally conduct and supervise the study. That means they have to be present, involved, to know the protocol, be available, see the patients. And sometimes in our studies, we might have a principal investigator who doesn't always see the patients. The patients are seen by a sub-investigator. And that's okay. It just, the investigator has delegated that responsibility. It needs to be documented. And the investigator has to be aware of those patients' participation and how they're doing in the study. Reviewing documents, knowing what the staff is doing, recruit and consent, and you would be surprised. It's very important that not just a coordinator knows how to consent patients, but investigators need to understand how to consent patients. And consents can be 20 to 25 pages long. And there's a lot of caveats with it. You need to make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, initials are in certain places, dates, printing, signature. And so it's important for investigators and study staff to know how to do that properly. And know the protocol metrics, so know what they're measuring and know what the outcomes are going to be. They're committing to informed consenting and IRB. So informing participants that activities are for investigational purposes, and that touches again on where Penny talked about therapeutic misconception. Making sure that if you're an investigator, you're wearing either your research hat or your clinical care hat, and you have to be objective, and you have to really inform the patients about the best care for them, and inform them about what the study is and what the risks are involved. Ensuring informed consent. You'll learn more about this as you go along. If you've been a coordinator or a researcher for a while and you understand consenting, you know it's not just signing a consent form one time, it's a whole process. And making sure that participants are continually informed throughout the process and throughout the study. And then following the IRB requirements. So making sure you're following the requirements for whichever IRB you're using. And then if you do use WERB, our central IRB, there might also be some guidelines that you have to notify UAB about, or rules that UAB requires as well. So there are a lot of regulations that you have to be aware of. Adverse event reporting. If something happens during the course of the study, the investigator is agreeing that he or she is going to notify the sponsor in the appropriate areas that something has occurred. It is the investigator's responsibility to also relate that event and causality to whether it was a study drug or intervention or device. They're also agreeing when they sign this 1572 and agreeing to this commitment that they've read and understand the investigator brochure. I can say that a majority of people, staff, investigators, we kind of breeze over the investigator brochure, but it's actually an important document. We tend to focus on the protocol, but you need to look at the investigator brochure as well. If you're not familiar with what that is, an investigational drug comes with a brochure that highlights past research in it, along with side effects, risks, those types of things. So it's an important document. You need to know all the risks and side effects. Again, attributing level of the adverse event and causality, and then definitely reporting unexpected events, so serious adverse events.
Is that investigation brochure for multi-site trials or single?
It can be multi-site or single site. It's if the drug is investigational. So if it hasn't been on the market, you're going to have one. If it's on the market, it's something that's just being used in a different manner, then they're typically going to refer to the brochure, the drug packet pamphlet. They're committing to training and informing the study team. So as we go through these commitments, you can understand where it's important for the investigator to be able to delegate tasks and have a good team in place in order to feel confident that these tasks are being accomplished, because they're still responsible for everything. They need to ensure all study associates, colleagues, and employees are assisting in the study are informed about the regulations, so knowing what the codes are, the FDA regulations, the IRB regulations, providing adequate training and education, and then documenting it's ensured. The documenting part is where we seem to drop the ball a lot. You know, if you're doing some industry studies or even investigator-initiated studies, if the protocol changes and an amendment comes out, or you've made a change to the protocol, a lot of times we send that through the IRB, the coordinators are aware of the change, it might affect eligibility or study procedures, but you also have to notify sub-investigators. And this can be challenging for areas. You have to find what works for your area. For us, we've created a form. We email the sub-investigator the amendment along with the form. We have them sign the form that they've read it, and we file that form as documentation that they have read and been trained on the changes to the protocol or the study. You can do the same with coordinators. You have to find a way to make sure you document. If you don't document, it wasn't done. If the FDA or another governing body comes in, the IRB, and you say, well, this is our standard process, this is what we do, but you have no documentation of it, it's not going to fly. So email's a great way to document, standard forms. These are all things that, you know, if you're training, and it's usually ongoing training, take a few minutes to make sure that you document what's been done with the study team. You can file it in a training binder, you can file it in your regulatory binder. The sixth commitment is maintaining adequate and accurate records. This is where a very organized, detail-oriented regulatory person or coordinator is key. There is so much paper in a world where we're moving to more electronic. Research is still very, very much paper-oriented. And so it needs to be very organized. You have to have some type of standard template or format that you use to organize all your documents. That includes regulatory documents, source documents, data capture tools. You need to make sure it's organized. It needs to be available. So if anybody comes in to inspect, the FDA, the IRB, that it's readily there, it's easily organized and easy to pull out. This includes paper records, electronic records, and case report forms. Committing to maintaining IRB approvals and communication. So ensuring that IRB is up to date, that you renew on time, that you submit on time, you notify them of any changes or issues. You're obtaining all of your reviews and approvals, properly reporting any issues, unanticipated problems, and then obtaining approval for any changes. So you want to obtain approval for those changes before you make any changes. This is highlighting, so commitment 8 is complying with those regulations, and this just is showing that, you know, those regulations work together. So they are kind of dry, they're challenging to read. Instead of the FDA regulations, like Penny said, the ICH is a little bit easier to read and understand, but you have to be aware of what the main points of those regulations are. Again, there's a warning on the bottom of that form. If you willfully falsify a statement or action, there is a criminal offense. And many times things occur and it's not willful, but the investigator is still at risk. So it might just be a lack of education or training or documentation, but it's still going to get, you know, there still can be actions from it. So you need to make sure that you're following the right steps. Questions on the 1572? Or the commitments? That kind of focuses on what the investigator is responsible for, which is pretty much everything. So we're going to talk about some other members of the team. There's the coordinator, which can be a nurse coordinator or a non-nurse coordinator. In previous years, I think research nurse coordinators were probably more prevalent, and now we've seen an increase in coordinators that are non-nurses. And there's a place for people. You don't have to be a nurse to be a coordinator. You just have to be trained and experienced and know your boundaries. And so the coordinator is usually a very specialized research professional. They work closely with the investigator. I would say if you look at most research teams, it's an investigator and a coordinator, and they have to have a very good working relationship because they do so much together and rely on each other so much. The principal investigator is responsible for the overall design and conduct, but the coordinator is the one that really coordinates and manages those day-to-day activities and plays a critical role in conducting the study. They can perform a number of duties and work with a number of areas, from the department, the sponsor institution, and then even compliance, all those areas. And then they report typically primarily to an investigator and maybe have other responsibilities in their department. And in our area, our coordinators report to the director, so they report to me, but we provide a service to investigators. So they still work very closely with their investigators. The investigators work with them to supervise the study, but not necessarily the coordinator. And that's worked well in our area, but not all areas are set up like that. And coordinators have a wide scope of responsibilities. These are very much the same scope as the investigator. And depending on where you are, you might have research nurses that see the patients, and you might have coordinators or data managers that handle the data and everything else. So we understand this is kind of broad, but it gives you an idea of how each area is different across campus. If you're lucky to have a regulatory administrator in your team, some of you, it might be you, but that person manages and maintains all the documentation for the study, which is a lot. They might handle invoicing and payments. They might handle if there's permits or licenses, CVs. They're responsible for maybe getting signatures on a lot of the documents. And there is a lot of confidentiality in this position. I think sometimes we focus on confidentiality when we talk about the investigator and the coordinator, but it applies to all members of the team because you're still going to be seeing a lot of that data and working with those patients in some form or manner. Data manager. I know Cancer Center has data managers, infectious disease has data managers, and it works well in their area. So the coordinators are the ones that see the patients, collect the data, and then they hand it off to the data managers who enter the data, handle queries, work with monitors. They might even help create data capture tools or databases. And so if you have somebody like that in your area, they're a critical part of the team. And they tend to work more with the sponsors on queries and data and maybe data analysis. A financial administrator is key to the team. It might be an individual in the study team. It might be somebody at the division or department level or school level that you work with. But this is the person that handles the budgets and the contracts. They know what's in the account. They know what's going out and what's coming in. They might handle the invoicing. And so they are very, very critical. The days of having clinical trials where we had massive budgets and lots of money left over are over. You need to be able to know what's in your account and what you have and where you're going to be 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road. And so you need to be able to know what your accounts are. It's just like your personal checkbook. Lab technicians, sometimes we forget about the lab in that if you have an area where you just send your labs to be processed, but a lab technician or somebody in the lab manager, might be really critical to your study, especially if it's investigator initiated or a federally funded study. They're not just collecting and processing specimens. They can help with the design of assays or even troubleshoot issues you might be having with samples and collection. So they're important in your study team. Another person that's important is the pharmacist. We do have a research pharmacy at UAB if you're not aware of it. They handle the storage and dispensing of the drugs. There is a fee associated with it, but they maintain all the accountability records. the refrigeration records, the storage records. They have a really very organized shop, and it takes a lot of the, I'd say, concern out of the investigator or the coordinator's hands if you use a research pharmacy. They're extremely helpful. So we talked about documentation, but if it's not documented, it's not done. And so you need to make sure that you're documenting what you do. That delegation log is important when you delegate tasks to study team members. Documenting when training was done. Checklists are great. I know if you have a lot of studies or a lot of staff or very little staff, you need the simplest way to make sure that you documented that things were done. We use a lot of checklists. We use a lot of standard forms. Karen will talk about some of those today, and we're happy to share those with you. But make it simple. Just make sure it's documented when you do stuff. And communicate. There's been a lot on campus about team science and building teams over the past year, but you have to have a really good functioning team in order to run a very successful clinical trial or clinical trial operation. So everybody has to work well together, you have to communicate, and you have to find what works for you. In our area, we have a large division. We have 6 sections within cardiology. Each section has their own unique way of doing things, their own personality kind of. And as a research unit, we've tailored our communication to each area. One section might like monthly meetings, another one wants a meeting every other Tuesday, one wants quarterly with regular emails. So find what works for your group and implement something where you're communicating on a regular basis, either in person, by email, however it works best. And when you do meet, you don't want to we seem to focus on maybe recruitment or where we're at with the study, but it's an opportunity to talk about any adverse events, any challenges or obstacles you're having, any concerns, and talk about your finances at that meeting as well. You want to make the best use of your time. If you're going to get together in person at a meeting, get as much as you can in that meeting. There's a lot of training. This class is one of the first classes that you can attend. Many of you might have already done some of these, but there's the Human Subjects Protocol training, GCP training. You'll have protocol-specific training, maybe sponsor-specific training. If you're going to be using Impact, if you're using any other software system. So there's a lot of training that goes into conducting a study. And if it's industry, they tend to provide you with those certificates. If it's not, if it's something you're doing here, generate your own checklist and document that it's been done. Hopefully you've learned that the PI is responsible for everything. He or she delegates, and you need to make sure you document that. Coordinator is responsible for managing a lot of the day-to-day stuff and really helping the investigator stay on track and stay organized and kind of keep helping him or her stay out of jail. And then everyone else on the research team is just as responsible. Are there any questions? I think I finished early. Yeah.
Is the laboratory technician listed on the 1572?
If they're going to be involved in some of the assays and development, you can. Otherwise, we typically will list, we use a lab that has maybe 5 technicians in it. We'll list the manager. And then we'll have documentation that that manager is on the 1572, but she has trained these 5 technicians, because you never know which of those technicians would be processing the samples. If you have a lab where it's always going to be the same technician, I'd put them on the 1572.
And that lab location, because specimens arrive there, whether they're de-identified or not,
Yeah.
they have to be listed as a site.
Mm-hmm.
And who's responsible for posting that data from the lab manager into the reportable? Who's responsible there?
At the lab,
You said lab manager oversees the lab technician. Well, how
That's-
is that data reported?
the technician, so if you're using a hospital lab, then the technician would enter that data into the hospital record, and then the coordinator pulls that information from the electronic record.
Okay, that's what I want to know.
And that's what, even though we've gone more electronic, we use a lot of paper in the research realm, and the institution has gone more electronic. So Penny and Carla and some others and I have worked on a program or a process to kind of help coordinators and monitors access the electronic medical record, so you wouldn't be printing off as many results and as many documents. That the monitors would come when they come for a visit and log into the electronic medical record themselves. And then they would look for that information instead of having to print off hundreds and hundreds of pages of records.
What if you have like a 2-year study where there are students and fellows that kind of rotate in and out and can be interact with the patient and or samples? How do you handle those that are transient like that?
We put ours on that. You have a lot too.
We don't.
You don't put them on? Then you answer and then I'll answer.
So ultimately, the PI is responsible for everybody, right? So where we put them is on the signature log. So if we have a fellow or somebody that's actually working really closely with the PI and doing things, if they're on the delegation of authority log or the signature log, the industry sponsors are fine with that. As long as they know that they're doing some of the, they may be doing some of the critical work, but it's not, they're never doing anything without the PI oversight. Because at our institution, unless it's changed, they cannot be PIs on studies, right? And so and you always have to go by what your sponsor, the sponsor may tell you, and that's another thing I was going to say earlier, is your sponsor will direct you as far as the lab tech even. If they feel that that's important to be on there. In the Cancer Center, that is not something that they've ever required that we do, because we always have our labs done at the UAB lab, which is on the 1572, or we're using the CCTS or the CRU, so they never require that one particular person be on there. So I think it just matters a lot. I always ask the sponsor what they want. Our regulatory managers always ask that. But general, our SOP is that we do not put them on there.
We always put them on the delegation log. So even if it's investigator initiated, if we had an investigator that read through a protocol and it went through UAB IRB, we have a delegation log that we use as a standard form for our unit. And we put everybody on there that's going to be touching the patients in a sense. So if there's fellows or residents that are going to be working on the project, then we'll put them on the delegation log. If it's going to be a fellow that's highly involved and they want to do some publication from it, they're going to be involved in the data analysis, or they've helped the investigator write the protocol, then we're going to list them on the...
And so IITs, that's very important for IITs. So difference between industry and IITs.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Anything else? All right. Who's next?
I'm next, but there's a break.
Oh, well, you have a break.
My watch just told me to stand up.
Yeah. Sitting out there long before now.
Oh, good. How are you? Good to see you too.
Things going good?
Yeah, well, how about you?
Good. I miss all y'all.
Oh, I miss you.
I miss seeing you and hearing your voices.
Very quiet. Your office is so it's very quiet.
That's what Liz says. She goes, I found myself going out and going around so I don't even pass by your office.
But it's so empty. No, it is. It's true.
And I just
And I supposed to tell Christina, I said,
because this is for you guys. What are you going to do? Send it to the office?
I don't know, get on the website. It's for my grant. Training opportunities. oh, I'm gonna be out of town for a $20. I'm like, there's like 6 people involved in this meeting. I said, this is assistant designer, and this is like HR. I saw him the other day, but he was coming out there, so he's not crossing the street and he's not, because he hasn't caught me if I'm going to do the center. And then give her your camera. You did that? You did some of that? Good. Well, I did try. So I was so upset because when I got time to get him, it was the day of his award thing. And he said, well, maybe 5:30. And I walked in and Penny was like doing her last little sayings and they handed her the, I looked for you in there.